Sometimes it seems that there is a strange pause in the history of humanity. As if someone began a story, took a few confident steps forward, and suddenly fell silent. We look into the past and see images of beings who were called gods, teachers, creators, those who came from outside and stayed nearby for a long time. And then, they disappeared. And it is precisely this disappearance that raises more questions than the appearance itself. Because if one assumes they were merely symbols, why do they behave as if making decisions? If we consider it a myth, why does the myth break off so sharply and without explanation? There is an interpretation that humans were not initially conceived as equals, but as instruments. As beings who need only be given skills, but not necessarily given choice. But something went differently. People began to ask questions, began to think independently. Something emerged that is difficult to control: free will. And free will, if we suppose, always carries risk. Because the same knowledge can be used for creation or for destruction. And then there arises the feeling that at some moment, someone took a step back. Not out of anger, not out of hatred, but, perhaps, out of caution. Perhaps, departure is not a flight into the sky, but a transition to another level of reality. Perhaps contact did not disappear, but simply became inaccessible. Or perhaps, for the first time, humanity was left alone to see what it would do without hints. So why, if we assume that they really were here, did they simply leave? If one tries to look at the ancient narrative without haste, there arises the feeling that the story does not end, but rather freezes mid-sentence. As if someone closed the door too quietly, not wanting it to be noticed. And it is in this silence that a version appears, which seems simple, almost convenient. The mission was accomplished. If we suppose that certain beings came to Earth with a specific purpose, it is logical to ask, what if they really did everything they intended to do? Taught, set things up, launched the process, and left, allowing the system to develop on its own. Do we not do the same when we finish a job we consider complete? But then doubt arises. Why does the departure look less like a neat conclusion and more like a sudden disappearance? Perhaps the plan was much simpler than we tend to think. Not civilization in the usual sense, not culture, not morality. Just functioning. A being capable of extracting resources, maintaining order, repeating actions. A human as an element of the scheme, not its center. But if that is so, why did something extra appear in this scheme? The ability to doubt. Free will looks like a miscalculation. Like a side effect that at first seems insignificant, but over time begins to change everything. After all, freedom is not just choice. It is unpredictability. It is deviation from the algorithm. And if we suppose that humans were created as performers, then the ability to ask questions may have become the most dangerous acquisition. Was it possible not to notice this? Or, on the contrary, was it noticed too late? When knowledge had already been passed on, skills mastered, and the process set in motion. And then there arises a sense not of a completed mission, but of one that came off track. Not a failure in the usual sense, but a moment when continuing became riskier than stopping. What if they did not leave because everything worked out, but because it became unclear how it would end? For knowledge combined with free will cannot be predicted. The same tool can become the basis for creation or the beginning of destruction. And this is no longer a question of control, but a question of trust. And trust, perhaps, was not part of the original plan. Sometimes it seems that ancient stories do not tell of victory or defeat. They are more like a report that was never finished. There is no final period in them, no triumph of outcome. There is only a sense of incompleteness. As if observation was interrupted and the experiment left without an observer. If we imagine that humans were indeed conceived as workers, another question arises. At what point does an instrument cease to be an instrument? When it begins to be self-aware. When it starts to ask why it does what it does. And if this moment was inevitable, does that mean the mistake was embedded from the very beginning? Or perhaps it is not a mistake at all. Perhaps free will was allowed intentionally, as a test. As the final stage of the mission, which was not spoken of directly. What will happen if the creation is left without supervision? Will it continue down the given path, or will it try to create its own? But then the question of departure returns. Why without explanation? Why without an attempt to correct the result? Why without returning? For if the mission was an experiment, it would be logical to expect observation until the end. Or, at the very least, intervention if the situation gets out of control. Perhaps intervention did happen, but not as we imagine it. Perhaps departure is not a physical disappearance, but a change in the form of presence. A transition to a level where contact is impossible directly. Where observation continues but without intervention. Or, on the contrary, where observation has ceased altogether. In ancient stories, one often senses a strange tension, as if the relationship between creators and creation has changed. Not enmity, not conflict, but distance. As if closeness had become undesirable. As if the very fact of presence began to influence development more strongly than absence. And then the version of a completed mission begins to sound different. Not completed fully, but only so far as it was safe. Everything else is left to the discretion of time, or to the discretion of humanity itself. But if the mission really failed, an even more troubling question arises. What exactly went wrong? The creation turned out to be too capable, too independent, too similar. And if so, perhaps departure was not a decision, but a necessity. Sometimes it seems that we still live inside the consequences of that choice. In a world where knowledge is passed down without an instruction for responsibility. Where free will is given without explanation. And where the question of origin remains open not because there is no answer, but because the answer may be too complex. So was the mission completed, or did it stop halfway? And if it stopped, who exactly made that decision? The ones who came, or the ones who were created? There is a sense that it is at the moment of the transfer of knowledge that the story makes its quietest, yet most dangerous turn. Before that, everything looks almost stable. The creation fulfills its task, repeats actions, lives within set boundaries. But knowledge never remains just a tool. It changes the one who receives it, even if it was not intended for that at the outset. If we suppose that humanity was indeed given something more than survival skills, the question arises, why? Why would a being created for work need to understand the structure of the world? Why explain patterns if it is enough to show the result? And why does knowledge in ancient stories always appear as a gift that must be paid for? Perhaps the point is that knowledge cannot be transmitted partially. Even simple understanding of cause and effect gradually leads to the next step, to the question, why? And after that comes another, what if? And it is precisely at that moment that free will is born, even if no one planned for it. Free will does not arise suddenly. It does not appear as a decision. It grows out of the ability to compare, to doubt, to choose between options. And if we suppose that humanity was created as a tool, then knowledge became that very factor which turned the tool into something else. Not immediately, slowly, almost imperceptibly. And here arises risk, because knowledge in itself is neutral. It carries no direction. It does not explain how exactly it should be used. The same ideas can lead to creation or destruction. And if you give knowledge to a being with free will, it is impossible to predict the outcome in advance. Perhaps this is precisely what became the point of tension. Not conflict, not rebellion, not war. But the realization that further development is beyond control. That the system no longer obeys the original parameters. That the experiment, if we suppose, begins to live its own life. Sometimes it seems that in ancient narratives one senses caution. As if knowledge was passed on gradually, in doses, observing the reaction. But even that was enough. Because as soon as the ability to understand appears, the possibility of total control disappears. A human who has received knowledge begins not only to perform, but also to interpret. He begins to seek meaning. Begins to build his own models of the world. And if we suppose that the original design did not include equality, then such a transformation could have appeared as a threat. In this context, departure ceases to be punishment or flight. It begins to resemble a refusal to take responsibility for the consequences. Not in a negative sense, but in a cautious one. As if a decision had been made not to interfere further, so as not to aggravate the situation. But knowledge, once given, cannot be taken back. It remains and continues to operate even in the absence of the source. It is passed on, distorted, supplemented, lost, and found again. And with each generation, free will becomes ever more pronounced. Could this process have been stopped? Or was it inevitable from the very beginning? Perhaps the very idea of creating a rational being already contains risk. Because reason, sooner or later, begins to ask questions that go beyond the task. And then another thought arises. What if knowledge was given intentionally, despite the risk? What if free will was not a mistake, but allowed as a possibility? As a chance to see what independent development would lead to. But even if so, the question of consequences remains. Because free will does not guarantee harmony. It only opens up a range. Within this range, there is room both for creation and for destruction. And if we suppose that this was noticed too early, the decision to leave may have been made precisely because of uncertainty. Sometimes it seems that we still live within this choice. We use knowledge without always understanding its consequences. We create technologies that change reality faster than we can comprehend their impact. And in this, there is a strange resemblance to the ancient narrative. Knowledge as a gift. Knowledge as risk. Knowledge as a point of no return. And if at some moment the decision was made to end direct contact, perhaps it was done precisely when it became clear, the rest of the path, humanity would walk alone. And only one question remains. Was this trust or caution? And if knowledge really became the reason for distance, is that distance itself not a part of the design? If one listens closely to ancient narratives, there arises a strange sense of dryness. There is little emotion in them, few embellishments, almost no attempt to impress. They sound as if they were written not to inspire, but to record. As if someone tried not to tell a story, but to leave a trace of a decision made. This is especially noticeable in the moments where distance appears. Not a sharp break, not a catastrophe, but a gradual withdrawal. As if closeness had become a problem. As if presence interfered more than it helped. And then the question arises. Why does a myth, which usually strives for symbols and images, suddenly here resemble a report? In these narratives, feelings are rarely mentioned. There is almost no regret or anger. There are actions. There are consequences. There is sequence. And this throws off the usual perception of myth as fantasy. For fantasy usually explains, justifies, softens. But here, it records. If we suppose that these texts reflect not invention, but interpretation of events, much starts to look different. Not like a legend, but as an attempt to preserve the memory of a process. Of how decisions were made. Of where disagreements arose. And of why the choice was made exactly so, and not otherwise. Disagreement in such a context does not resemble conflict. It is more like a divergence of logics. As if one side continued to see humanity as part of the system, and the other, as something that goes beyond it. And the more independent humanity became, the harder it was to maintain a unified view. Sometimes it seems that the distance arose not between gods and people, but within the very plan. As if the original idea began to diverge from the result. And this divergence could not be eliminated by a simple correction. Because it concerned not the details, but the foundation. If we consider ancient narratives as protocols, a new logic appears in them. Repetitions begin to look like clarifications. Contradictions, as different points of view. And pauses, as moments when the decision has not yet been made, but movement has already stopped. What is especially strange is that these texts almost never contain a final explanation. As if the authors deliberately left room for uncertainty. Not because they did not know the answer, but because the answer itself was inconclusive. Or changed over time. Is it possible to imagine that observation continued, but intervention became impossible? That presence began to distort the process? And then distance became the only way to preserve at least part of the plan. Not as a refusal, but as a condition. In this case, myth ceases to be a fairy tale. It becomes a record of how difficult it is to control something that is capable of change. And how hard it is to make a decision, when any action influences the result more strongly than inaction. There is a feeling that in these narratives, the pauses between the events are more important than the events themselves. Moments of waiting, silence, absence of reaction, as if it is in those very pauses that the most important thing happens, the reappraisal of what is taking place. And then, distance appears not as a departure, but as a new form of presence. Colder, more cautious, deprived of direct contact. And if we assume that this was done deliberately, it becomes clear why the text sounds so detached. Because detachment is the language of an observer, of one who no longer participates directly, but still records the changes. And if that is so, then myth is merely a shell for something more pragmatic. Sometimes it seems that this is precisely why ancient stories do not strive to be understandable. They do not fully explain motives. They do not set accents. They simply leave a trace, as if expecting that understanding will come later, or will not come at all. And a strange feeling remains, as if we are reading not a story of the past, but a fragment of a document from which the last page has disappeared. The one that was supposed to sum things up. But it is not there. There is only a record about distance. And about how, after it, everything went differently. Why do these texts appear so restrained? Why is there so little mythical splendor in them? And why do they resemble observation more than faith? Perhaps because they were an attempt to capture the moment when a decision has already been made, but its consequences have not yet manifested. And if so, then distance is not the end of the story. It is the point from which the story ceases to be manageable. And after that, all that remains is to watch. When people speak of departure, almost always they imagine movement away. A flight, disappearance, rupture. But if you listen closely to ancient formulations, there arises a sense that it is not so much about direction as about a state. As if it was not the place that changed, but the way of being near. The word, sky, in these stories sounds strangely neutral. It is not described in detail. It is not specified where it is or what it looks like. It is simply noted as another level, as a boundary beyond which direct presence is no longer possible, or no longer permitted. And then the question arises, what if sky never meant escape? If we suppose that contact became dangerous, not only for humans, but for the observers themselves, the logical step might not have been evacuation, but distance. Not leaving the world, but leaving interaction. As if a decision was made to remain, but to stop interfering. Sometimes it seems that in these stories, leaving resembles quarantine. Not punishment, not isolation out of fear, but a temporary limitation of contact. When the system becomes unstable, any interference can intensify the chaos. And then the most cautious step is to observe, without touching. But if that is so, then, sky ceases to be a place. It becomes a mode, a form of presence without participation. As if someone stayed to watch but stopped speaking, remained close but no longer gives hints. And in this silence, for the first time, the human is faced with the necessity of making choices without external guidance. Can this be called departure? Or is it rather a change of role? From participant to observer, from mentor to witness. And if we assume that such a transformation was conscious, then ancient stories begin to sound different. Not as a tale of loss, but as a description of changed circumstances. In these stories there are almost no scenes of farewell. No final words. No explanations. As if they were not considered necessary. Or as if explanation itself could have become interference. And then silence appears not as emptiness, but as an action. Sometimes there arises the feeling that sky is a metaphor for inaccessibility. Not distance, but a mismatch of levels. As if direct contact was no longer possible not for lack of desire, but because of differences in development. Or, on the contrary, because of too much similarity. What if the creation became too autonomous to interact with in the former way? What if any word, any gesture began to alter the course of events more strongly than before? And then refusal of direct interference could have been the only way to preserve the freedom of the process. There is a strange silence in these stories after the departure, as if the world remains without external commentary. And it is at this moment that the human begins to speak for themselves. To create their own systems, their own meanings, their own explanations. And if we assume that this was the goal, then departure becomes not an ending, but a condition. But the question remains, was this departure final? Or is it only a change of the form of presence? Because in the texts, at times, one feels not absence but observation. Not interference but attention. As if someone continues to follow the development, without influencing it directly. If we imagine that contact was not broken, but translated into another mode, much becomes less dramatic. Not a catastrophe, not an escape, but a pause. Prolonged, perhaps necessary. A pause in which it is tested whether the human is capable of existing without constant supervision. Sometimes it seems that we ourselves reproduce this model. When we teach, when we guide, when we let go, and when we understand that further interference may only do harm. And then refusal of direct participation becomes a form of trust. Or, at least, a form of caution. But if this is trust, why is it accompanied by silence? Why is there no return? Why is there no renewed contact? Or perhaps it does occur, but we are no longer able to recognize it. Because we expect former forms. And the forms have changed. What if sky is not a place above us, but a space outside our perception? Not because it is far, but because we are not yet ready to notice it. And if so, then departure is not a step back, but a step aside. Into a realm where presence does not require visibility. In these reflections, there is no sense of an ending. Rather, there is a sense of transition. As if the story simply changed its plane. And we continue to live within it, not knowing at what moment observation might again become interaction. Or whether it will at all. And then the question remains open. Was it a departure? Was it a quarantine? Or was it always another plane of reality, to which the human is only just approaching? And if approaching, then what exactly will be the sign that the distance has again diminished? If we step back a little further and look at all these stories as a single canvas, it becomes noticeable how often the same motifs repeat in them. Arrival and distance, transmission and silence, observation and refusal of direct participation. As if the story is not told along a straight line, but moves in circles, returning to the same points, each time from a different angle. Almost everywhere there appears a moment when presence becomes a problem, when interference begins to change the course of events more strongly than absence. And then, instead of a loud finale, there arises silence. Not as emptiness, but as a pause. As an interval between actions, which stretches over generations. There is a sense that these ancient stories do not so much explain the past, as leave traces of processes. In them, the events themselves are not as important as the repetition of decisions. To transmit knowledge, to step back, to observe, to let time do its work. And each time, it appears not as a conclusion, but as a transition. With time, the consequences of this pause begin to be felt more strongly. The world, left without an external guide, learns to speak to itself. It creates its own meanings, its own systems, its own answers. Sometimes, cautiously. Sometimes, abruptly. Sometimes, as if someone is still watching, but not interfering. Freedom, which at first seems a gift, gradually becomes a burden. Because without hints, choice becomes more difficult. Without the observer, responsibility is felt more sharply. And perhaps this is the main trace of distance, not loss, but the necessity to decide independently. Sometimes it seems that we still live within this experiment. We use knowledge, not always understanding its limits. We develop technologies that outpace our questions about consequences. And in this there is a strange echo of the ancient story, as if it did not end, but simply continued in another form. The motifs repeat on another scale as well. We ourselves teach, and then step back. We create, and then let go.